Okay. All right, looks like we're live. Welcome back to my Bible study as we go through the book of Genesis. We have 2 chapters to go. Today we're in chapter 49 and then chapter 50, which is the final chapter in the book of Genesis. So last time I lost my stream, and so we cut the Bible study short. So today we're going to pick back up in chapter 49. I'll do kind of a summary, and then we missed the second half of chapter 49. So I think we'll just go over chapter 49 because I kind of just had gotten started with it last week, and it is an important chapter. And then next time we'll go and we'll do chapter 50. So I'm Pam Fox. Thank you for being here. Welcome back if you are a subscriber. If this is your first time, I'm simply going through the book of Genesis verse by verse. And we've been doing this all year. Verse by verse, I give my commentary. I'm not a Bible scholar, but I give my commentary. And I learn, and hopefully you learn too, about the origins in the Bible of the Israelite nation, how Israel came to be, their beginnings, their foundation. I think it's really interesting stuff, and I hope you do too. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're in Genesis chapter 49, verse 1, and I am in the King James Version. So like I said, we already went through some of this, but let's just go ahead and start from verse 1. And I was so distracted last week because my stream quality was really poor, and it kept coming up on the screen, and I didn't even know if I was still recording. So we just cut it short. So let's just go ahead and start back at verse 1. So it says, and Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." So remember, Jacob had been reunited with Joseph. Their whole family had been reunited. They were there living in Egypt during those 7 years of famine, and Joseph was taking care of his family. And now Jacob is an old man. He thinks he's about to die. And so, as was the custom, he gathered his family together to give his last words and to give the blessing, which was custom, to make sure everybody knew, what the wishes of the father were after he left. Kind of like you and I today, we might leave a will that says to our children, these are my wishes. This is what I want you to carry out. And this is what you get. This is what I'm leaving behind, and this is who it's for, and that kind of stuff. So these would be his final words, his final wishes. And what they call it is the blessing. So he would give this blessing. And really, when you look at it, and we're going to read through it here in a minute, you can almost look at it as prophecy. Well, you can look at it as prophecy because much of this stuff, you and I know, we can look back in the Bible as we see the story continue to be written of the beginnings of the Israelite people. We see these blessings that Jacob is going to speak upon his sons. We see them fulfilled, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. I'm not going to go real deep into that because that's a pretty deep Bible study, but we'll just mention a few things that I find interesting as we go through these. So Jacob is gathering his sons together to give them his final words, or AKA the blessing. And as we read some of these, you might wonder yourself, how is that a blessing? Like, some of them don't seem very nice. So what we have to understand when we think about this idea of the blessing is, one, it's prophetic. God spoke through him, so he can be considered a prophet. And two, the blessing, when you and I think of blessing, we think of good fortune, right? We think, oh, it's our lucky day. It's something really good. But what you have to remember is God, with his people, he gives all of his children blessings, and they look different, right? Like, to one person, they might have, they might be a really good friend. I mean, we could come up with all kinds of examples. They might be have the blessing of being able to be a good nurturer, or be a person of strength, or whatever it is. Jacob was a man who was a father who had all these sons. And we can look at Jacob through the filter of typology, which is to say that Jacob was a father of many sons, and our God is our heavenly father, and he has children, sons of God, which just means his people. It can be sons and daughters. And as a heavenly father, he wants the blessing for his children who he loves, right? He wants what's best for them. He wants what's good for them. He wants that blessing. And so you and I are blessed in all kinds of ways, right? All kinds of ways. Like I live here in this tiny little 1-bedroom apartment. And a lot of people would come in here and think, man, why don't you live in a house, or why do you live like this? And I consider this home a blessing. Like I really do feel like it's a blessing from God. So a lot of times your blessings are how you look at them, right? Are you a glass half empty kind of person or a glass half full kind of person? How do you look at things? And then a lot of it is what you do with your life, right? I mean, there are, and you guys probably know many examples. We see it all around us, maybe even in yourself, of people who are given so much and they squander it away, right? They waste their life. Like I was fortunate enough to be born here in this country, home of the land of the free and home of the brave, or whatever it is. I was fortunate enough to be born into a home with a loving mother and a father. I was fortunate enough to not be born into extreme poverty. I mean, I have a lot of blessings. And I could have taken all of that and thrown that away, right? I could be living on death row right now. It just depends on the choices that you make with your life. So all that to say, when we get into these blessings and you start to wonder, how is that a blessing? Remember those things that I just said, and that a blessing isn't necessarily like you just won the lottery. The blessings are God's goodness that he pours out onto his people. Um, and they don't always get fulfilled, maybe necessarily in the way we think they should. All right, so let's go ahead and read this. So he says, and Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Now that phrase last days, it really is synonymous with the idea of how things are going to turn out. So he's going to tell his kids, his sons, how things are going to turn out for you, right? That idea of in the last days. This is how things are going to turn out for you. This is how things are going to be fulfilled for you. So he says, verse 2, gather yourselves together and hear ye, sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. Remember, Israel, Jacob, they're synonymous. God renamed Jacob Israel. So when you see those words, they're synonymous or interchangeable. So hearken unto Israel your father. Verse 3, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel. Because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defilest thou it. He went up to my couch. So remember, we talked about this last time, but Reuben was the technical firstborn of Jacob. But just like, was it Ishmael who says he despised the birthright and he sold it to his brother Jacob for a bowl of soup? We start to see this idea that the birthright, which is to be the firstborn and to gain or to acquire the double portion or the abundance of the inheritance, right? The premier of the inheritance, which is the best of the inheritance. You don't have to be firstborn to be a firstborn, and you can be firstborn and be disqualified from that title. So the reason I keep harping on this is because it's important for you and me as Christians, as believers, to understand this principle that God is laying down here in the first book of our Bible, that God has his sons or his children, his people, his believers, sons and daughters, who he wants the best for. Those are the people he considers the firstborn. Those are the people that are going to get the premier inheritance. Okay. I'm not talking about salvation. We talked about this last time. Salvation is a free gift from God. We receive it through our faith in Christ. When God looks at us and the blood of Christ is on us, he looks at us and he sees innocent people that don't have to sit before the judge on Judgment Day, right? So he sees innocent people. But the firstborn that firstborn status is something that you can either acquire, right? So now I'm talking about works. I'm talking about your life. I'm talking about your faith in God. I'm talking about what you do with that faith. So we can acquire that firstborn status, or we can disqualify ourselves from that firstborn status. And the Bible talks about Jesus as being, he's the firstborn unto God. He's God only begotten son, although he wasn't born. He's holy and divine and is fully divine. But he's considered the only begotten son of God, and he's considered the firstborn, the heir, right? And God is going to give all things, it says, to Jesus. But his people can be considered co-heirs with Christ. Okay, so I know I talk a lot about this, and I know it probably bothers some people because a lot of Christians understand that, and I agree, that our salvation is a free gift from God. There's nothing we can do to earn it. There's nothing we can do to be disqualified from it. But our salvation and the inheritance, in my opinion, are two separate things. And we really see this played out here in the first book of our Bible, in Genesis, in terms of this family. All right, so here we have Reuben. He was disqualified as the firstborn. Why? Because of the choices that he made. He disqualified himself as the firstborn because of the choices he made. What did he do? He slept with his father's wife. And so he was disqualified. He committed adultery. And not just adultery, but it was with his father's wife, which means he dishonored his father. Which is a big deal. I mean, you and I are supposed to honor our Heavenly Father in heaven. We're not supposed to dishonor him, and we're not supposed to commit adultery, which is to say be unfaithful, right? There's this idea in adultery, we think of it as a sexual thing because we're unfaithful to our spouse, which is true, but we can be unfaithful to God. God calls that idolatry. We can be unfaithful to him and worship other gods. And so then we've cheated on God by worshiping other gods. And so it's a big deal in God's eyes. And so we see this playing out. Reuben dishonored his father by sleeping with his father's wife. And so he disqualified himself as the firstborn. And so then we're going to see here in a moment, then who is the firstborn? Who earned that firstborn status? Well, it was Joseph. Joseph, despite all of his struggles, despite his brothers hating him, plotting to kill him, selling him into slavery, despite Joseph going into Egypt as a slave, living in prison, all of those things, he remained faithful to God and he served God. And so his father recognizes this, and he earns the status of firstborn, even though he's not the firstborn. He was the 11th born of 12 sons. All right, so he says in verse 4, unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, talking about Reuben. Because thou wentest up to thy father's bed. So verse 5, he moves on to Simeon and Levi. He says, Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Mine honor be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a well. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So remember, Simeon and Levi were the ones that plotted to kill, I can't remember, Shechem was, I think, his name. And then they ended up killing him and his entire clan. And in my opinion, he deserved it, but that's not what matters. What matters is these two men got fiercely angry and they acted on it by killing all these guys, by tricking them and deceiving them and then slaughtering them. And so Jacob is recognizing here now, even though it happened a long time ago, and there was apparently forgiveness for that. They were never like tried or condemned or anything like that. But the judgment is here in this so-called blessing. He says, he basically says, cursed be their anger, for it was fierce. It was wrath. It was cruel. I divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now, here is something really interesting. When we fast forward into the future, we see, so remember, each of these sons became clans or tribes. This is how Israel was born. 400 or 500 years later after this, when Israel is set free out of captivity from Egypt, we have these different clans and tribes. They're, wandering in the wilderness before they come into the promised land. And they kept very careful records. We'll see that in later on in the Bible, but they kept very careful consensus of their people. How many people were in their tribes? And when they left Egypt, Simeon's tribe was the third largest, but by the time they left to the wilderness, they were the smallest. So they had really shrunken in numbers. And then a little bit later, when so Israel, what we know today as Israel, when it was broken up and all of the borders were established, and all of that is in the Bible, and all of these different sections of land were given to these different tribes, the tribe of Simeon wasn't even given their own. They were the only tribe that wasn't, well, besides Levi, neither of them were given their own acreage of land for their tribe. Simeon just barely made it in, I would say, by the skin of their teeth. They were given a portion of land within the land of Judah, who received Judah, and then Joseph, which was divided up into his two sons, were given the double portion. They received the best of the land of Israel. So it's just interesting here that it says that Simeon and Levi, that they'd be divided in Jacob, aka Israel, and they would be scattered in Israel. So Simeon was given a small portion of land within. So Judah's land was, divided, and Simeon's tribe was given a small sect of that land. And then the Levites weren't given any land. They were scattered among all of Israel. They were the priests. And so think of the priests like we think of modern day government, which is to say that the government works for the people and that their job is to provide for and care for the needs of the people the best way they can. And so these priests, they were who you went to if you had a dispute. They acted as judges. They were who you went to if there was some type of a court case where someone, evidence was brought before these priests, and then they would say, okay, well, they knew the law. They would say, this is the law, this is the punishment, and they would carry out that punishment. So the priests were kind of like the government in that way. More importantly, they were responsible for all of the religious ceremonies that God instructed them to carry out, and they were responsible for studying and knowing God's law and teaching that to the people. So those were the priests, and they lived all throughout Egypt. They weren't given an acreage of land for their tribe. They were scattered. Okay. And by the way, we'll see later in the book of Exodus, we'll see the Levitical tribe. Well, let's not get too far ahead for time's sake. Let's go ahead and move on. So scattered in Israel, verse 8. Okay, so Judah. So now we're moving on to Judah. We've talked about Simeon. We've talked about Levi. We've talked about Reuben. Judah, verse 8. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thine hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. So we're going to talk, he's going to talk quite a bit about Judah here. It's kind of a long blessing. So remember, the tribe of Judah was the tribe that God raised up kings for the Israelite nation. So for a long time, they didn't have a king, but they would grumble and complain like everybody else has a king. All these other countries have kings. All these other nations, everyone's got kings but us. God was their king. But they grumbled and grumbled about it enough. And of course, God knew that would happen. And Judah was, here in this prophecy, was the tribe that those kings would come forth. And it began with King David. And then after him, his descendants after him. And it culminates in Jesus Christ, who came from the line of Judah. And Jesus Christ, of course, is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They put a crown upon his head when he was crucified. They wrote there, King of the Jews, on his placard on the cross. And of course, he never did set up his reign. He never was king of Israel on his first coming, but he promised that he would return. And if we go to the very end of our Bibles and study Revelation and other prophecies throughout the Bible, we'll see that Jesus will return. We'll see the prophecy that says Jesus will return, and that he will set up his kingdom on earth and be king of not just Israel, but of the whole entire earth. So that's a prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled. So let's go ahead and read this. He says, "Thy father's children will bow down before thee." Verse 9 says, "Judah is a lion's whelp." Now remember, the lion and Jesus are synonymous. So all of this is prophetic before the coming of Christ. So we have prophecy before the coming of Christ. We have prophecy after the coming of Christ, but it's all about Christ. And a lot of times they'll use these words like a lamb that was slain, or the Lion of Judah, and these are referencing Jesus Christ. So here it says, Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And Shiloh is synonymous with Jesus as well. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. And I think that line right there, I think is fast forwarding to the end times. And unto him shall the gathering of his people be, because we see in the end times in Revelation, we see a lot of gathering, harvesting of God's people unto Christ before Jesus comes and sets up this millennial kingdom where he reigns the earth for 1,000 years. Very exciting stuff. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come. And of course, he did come. He came, and then he went back to heaven, and he promised he'd be back. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Verse 11, binding his foal unto the vine. So we're still talking about Judah, the tribe of Judah, binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. So here there's like all of this kind of symbolic terminology around the vine and around wine and grapes. So the land of Judah was commonly known to be very fertile land. They grew a lot of vineyards and grapes there, and other fruits, olives and things like that. But it was really well known to be kind of like what we think of like Napa Valley down in California, is like, wine country. And so it's talking about, again, it's prophetic. He's talking about binding his foal into the vine and his ass's colt into the choice vine. That word choice, it's a word that's synonymous with premier or value or wealth. And so we have this idea of, wealth there in the land of Judah because of the fertility of the land, and the vineyards. It says he washing your garments in wine and your clothes in the blood of grapes. It's like they're just swimming in grapes or swimming in money. It says his eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk. Remember, Israel was known as the land of milk and honey. So red with wine and white with milk. And that's it. So that's the blessing for Judah. Next is Zebulun, verse 13. It says, Zebulun shall dwell in the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. And that was fulfilled. The tribe of Zebulun, the land that was given to them was located between the Mediterranean and the I forget, the sea that's just to the east of that, the Caspian Sea, I think. Their land was right between all these bodies of water. So they were, ships merchants, and they did a lot of trade and a lot of travel by water. And they lived on the water. So it says thou shalt dwell in the haven of the sea and be a haven for ships. And this shall be the border unto Zidon. Verse 14, Issachar. So that was it. So some of these blessings are really short and some are really long. Issachar is a strong ass, couching down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Verse 16, Dan shall judge his people. So this is the tribe of Dan. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder and in the path. An adder is like a snake that biteth the horse's heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. So again, this is another one that's really interesting, because Dan, if you go and you read In the book of Judges in the Old Testament, it's all about this and how the tribe of Dan, the Danites, it was through that tribe that God raised up judges. So as we see the Israelite nation growing and developing, we see these different things take place. And this is one of the things that took place. It was a time of rising up judges. So they already had the Levites, and the Levites had a lot of duties. They worked pretty much nonstop. The Levites did, and one of their duties was to carry out judgment. And so then it was divided, and then you had the Levites, and now we had the judges, and the judges came from the tribe of Dan. And another thing that happened, unfortunately, was it was the tribe of Dan that began worshiping idols. We see that also in the book of Judges. And that was a huge no-no, obviously. We talked about that before. It's this idea of being unfaithful to God, committing adultery, and worshiping these other gods instead of worshiping the one true God, the God that made all things and made life possible. They go and worship these, made-up gods. And so that was Dan that kind of introduced, it was something that people did. It's not like it was the first time, like in the people of Dan, but they set up an altar unto a false god. And they were God's people that he had selected to be judges. And then they went and committed one of the worst crimes, that God told us not to commit. So it says, and it talks about that here, verse 17, it says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path. A serpent is someone who's subtle and crafty. We see that in the very first chapters of the book of Genesis, when it talks about the serpent there in the garden. He was subtle and crafty, which means, they don't just come out like the boogeyman and just destroy and kill. They come out and they say things that are probably true and that sound really good in order to kick you one step closer to deceiving you into something that's not good and that is a lie, for the sake of the serpent. He doesn't care about what happens to the people. And so here is Jacob is talking about Dan as saying, you're going to be a serpent and you're going to bite the horse's heels, and his rider shall fall backward. So, this idea of introducing idolatry into his tribe, into the tribe of Dan, really caused some serious repercussions. All right, verse 18, he says, I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Gad, this is the next tribe or son, Gad. He says, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. And that's it. Verse 20, out of Asher, this is another one of the sons. His bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. So I'm just going to start kind of going through these a little bit quicker because I do have to be at work here in less than an hour. So Asher, his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. Naphtali, so the next brother, is a hind let loose. He grieveth goodly words. And then Joseph, verse 22. Joseph, and this is going to go on and on. So let's try to just get through it. I'll give a little bit of commentary. This first verse especially, it says, Joseph is a fruitful bow. Even a fruitful bow by a well, or bough. We're talking like a branch on a tree. So bough. Whose branches run over the wall. So right out of the gate, he begins to bless Joseph, and he says, you're a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. So this is a picture of a tree that has a lot of growth, that doesn't have stunted growth. It's by a well, which means it gets plenty of water. It's growing very tall over the wall, and it's fruitful, right? It's fruitful, which means, when you have trees, some are fruitful, some are not. Some are extremely fruitful, some maybe just, a couple of plums on it and that's it. But when a tree is fruitful, that means there's an abundance of fruit that tree is producing. It's a healthy tree. And Jacob, his father, is comparing him to this fruitful tree. So what I find interesting here is when we fast forward, we'll see, if you're new to the Bible, you might start to wonder at this point, I wonder if Jesus comes from the line of Joseph. That would make the most sense, right? Because Joseph was such a strong comparison or type or prototype of Jesus. But Jesus didn't come from that line of Joseph. But Jacob is making it very clear that Joseph would be a fruitful bough. Okay, Jesus is going to come from the line of Judah. But nevertheless, he's making it very clear that Joseph will be a fruitful bough. And of course, Joseph's life was fruitful from the get-go. I mean, we saw that. I mean, like I said before, even though his brothers conspired to kill him, sold him into slavery, he was put in prison, even though he was innocent. All these different things that happened to Joseph, his life was still immensely fruitful. Verse 23. So now Jacob's going to talk a lot about Joseph here. So let's just get through it. He says, the archers have sorely grieved him. Remember, this is prophetic. And shot at him and hated him. But his bow abideth in strength. It's like a bow and arrow. And the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Talking about himself, the shepherd, the stone of Israel. The stone, the foundation, the beginnings of the country known as Israel. That's Jacob. Well, technically it's Abraham, but God worked through each, started with Abraham, then the son Isaac, and then Jacob was the one that had all these sons, and was the one that was named Israel by God. Verse 25, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. So he's really just kind of laying it on thick here, blessing upon blessing upon blessing for Joseph, for the clan of Joseph, for the tribe of Joseph, for the descendants of Joseph. Verse 26, the blessings of thy father are prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors, my ancestors, unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph. That is blessing upon blessing upon blessing. And on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. He's talking about Joseph because he was separated from his brothers. And that's it. And then Benjamin, it says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. So interestingly, that's all he says about Benjamin. But Benjamin was known, their tribe was known as strong. They were known as fierce. They were known as warriors. They were known as soldiers. Paul, who was technically the first king of Israel, but he wasn't from the line of Judah. He was just the man that they kind of hastily, they wanted a king, and then Saul was the guy. He was a Benjamite. He was a fierce warrior. Who else? There were several examples. I'm trying to think. I can't think of any others right now. Oh, Paul. So Paul in the New Testament, also a Benjamite. So if you know anything about Paul before his conversion, before he met Jesus there on the road to Damascus, he was very fierce, and he was a what do you call it? Like a Sadducee, but he came from the line of Benjamin. And he would arrest Christians and have them tried and beaten and killed. He was fierce before his conversion, but he came from the tribe of Benjamin, which is interesting because he was a Sadducee, and I thought all Sadducees were Levites, but apparently they weren't. Okay. So Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. All right, how we doing on time? Okay. All right, so we got a few more verses here, just 4 or 5 verses, and we'll be done. Now he's going to transition into his death and burial. He goes on to say, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it, that their father spake unto them, and blessed them. Every one according to his blessing, he blessed them. And he charged them, and he said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. So he's once again, remember, he already struck a deal with Joseph and made him promise that he wouldn't be buried in Egypt, but that he would be buried with his fathers in Israel. Now he's charging all of his sons. He's making sure they know that his wish is to be buried with his fathers, with Abraham and Sarah and Rebekah and Isaac. So he says he charges them. He wants to be buried. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron. He says in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan. So he's being very specific, reminding them exactly where it's at. So there's no question. He says, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. So we went over that earlier in the book of Genesis when Abraham bought this land. He says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. Remember, he technically had 4 wives. He married Leah first because he was tricked into marrying her by Leah's dad. And then he married Rachel. That was the one he wanted to marry, the one that he loved. But when she died, they were traveling, and she ended up being buried in Bethlehem. And I'm not sure why that is. But she was buried in Bethlehem, and everyone else was buried at this other spot. So he's just reiterating all of this. He says, verse 32, the purchase of the field and the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. Remember, I don't know if you remember that earlier in the chapter. There was the whole story about how they acquired this land for a tomb. Verse 33, and when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered unto his people. So you'll see this sometimes in the Old Testament, this yielding up the ghost, which is this idea of separation of the physical body and the spiritual soul, yielding up the ghost. And was gathered unto his people, which is these people firmly believe that when they believed in resurrection, they believed when the earthly body died, that the soul was resurrected, that it lived, that really there was no such thing as death. They didn't fear death, I don't think, nearly as much as we do. And you see that in all of the things, like when people would go into battle, and I mean, it's like they didn't care. It's just like, I mean, I'm sure it was sad when someone died or whatever, and I'm sure people fought to live, but I think we look at death a lot differently than they did. They believed in resurrection. They didn't believe that there really was a death. There was a death of the physical body, but the person lived on. Okay, so here he's saying he yielded up the ghost and was gathered into his people. His ghost, his spirit lived on. Got to go and be with Rebecca, or be with Rachel, his wife that he loved, see his father, Isaac, his mom, Rebecca, his grandpa Abraham, grandma Sarah. He was gathered into his people, which I don't know, I think is really cool, because I've had a lot of loved ones die, and I miss them, and I look forward to being gathered into them and sitting down and shooting the breeze and getting to know each other again and talking about this life and their life and what they've been doing all these years since they've been gone, or whatever. I don't know. I like to think about that stuff. I firmly believe, obviously, in the resurrection, that when we do die, we don't really die. Yes, these physical bodies, they come to, the heart stops beating and all of that, but the soul, who I am, doesn't stop living. It goes on to a place that is prepared for souls, which the Bible tells us to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So it's something I personally really, really look forward to. Not to say I don't love my life. I do. And I'm very happy and extremely blessed. I have a lot of exciting and fun things going on in my life. But boy, oh boy, I do look forward to being present with the Lord. I really do look forward to that. And I hope you do too. When Jesus left, he said, I go to prepare a place for you. So I don't think there's really anything on this earth that can compare with what our Lord has prepared for us. So personally, I really look forward to what that entails, what that's going to look like. Because God really loves us. I mean, he just really, really loves us. And if you think about the love you have for your own children and how you want only the best, you have such a depth of love for your child or your children that you want only the best. You want them to be happy. You don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to be in pain. You want them to experience all the goodness of life. That's what God wants for us. Unfortunately, we are living in a time where he allows bad things to happen. He allows us to struggle, but through those struggles, he's with us. And through those struggles, we grow. We can grow in our faith through those struggles, which can be a really amazing experience. I know for myself, it's been an amazing experience to grow in faith through my own struggles and pain and brokenness. So yeah. All right. Well, I do have to get going. So thanks for joining me today. I pray, as always, a blessing upon you, my viewers. May God intervene in your lives and really just provide for your needs and bless you and keep you from evil. I pray that he's the author and the finisher of your faith. And I pray that he gives you strength for whatever you're dealing with right now in your life, for whatever is around the corner. And I pray that he give you strength of faith, that faith of a mustard seed that can grow into a tall tree, that small faith. God can nourish and water and shine upon that faith and help it to grow. I know in my own walk, I have struggled with faith on and off throughout my entire life, but God, he is the author and the finisher of my faith, and he's really done an incredible thing. And much of the time it's been through brokenness. So anyway, all right, guys. Well, I do have to get going. Thank you for watching, and God bless.